Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Randy Bach. Today's November 14, 2022, and I am here speaking with Jim Gottstein, who is an attorney and an interesting guy. He's worked for Psychiatric Patient Rights. I'm going to let him explain his kind of pathway and interests and so forth himself before we go on to have a discussion of some of the topics he brings up. As you can see in the background, he's the author of the Zyprexa papers. Zyprexa, if I'm not mistaken, is an antipsychotic and made by Eli Lilly, and there have been some issues with it. So, without further ado, Mr. Gottstein, tell us what's new and different in Maui, Hawaii, for which we should all be jealous, and in your interests and struggles and how you arrived at this particular kind of slice of attack from being an attorney and so forth.
Well, Maui, we're waiting for the whales to come back, the humpback whales, and that's always a good day when that happens. I listen for them, when I go swimming in the ocean, which is most days. So I'm very lucky in a lot of ways. And one of them is that in 1982, I got in a situation where I didn't sleep. I'd already been practicing law for a couple of years, and I became, what the clinical word is, manic. I jumped out of the second floor window in my underwear because I thought the devil was coming down the hall. So that was perfectly logical. I knew how to do a parachute landing fall. And so I did that and I was fine. I was in my underwear. It was 1 a.m. in June, but in Anchorage, it's light. I ran across the street. And I was looking around my shoulder for the devil. So I was spinning around and I got captured and hauled to the hospital in a straitjacket. And they shot me up, gave me an injection of something that put me to sleep. And when I woke up, there was a young man at the end of the desk with a clipboard. And he asked me, "What day is it?" And I asked him, how long have I been asleep? So he writes down, that I'm not oriented to time, that I didn't know what day it was. So that was kind of typical. And then when I, told people, I was told that I would never practice law again, that I was, permanently mentally ill and I would never practice law again. And those that believed I was a lawyer. Well, no, when I told them that I had graduated from Harvard Law School, that confirmed I was delusional. So, and I write in my book about, a similar thing where my client, Bill Bigley, told the psychiatrist that there was a write-up about him in the New York Times, and that was put down as, proof that he was mentally ill. Well, in fact, he had been written up in the New York Times.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm just going to back up a tiny bit. So I grant that you have graduated from Harvard Law School. The episode was what year? 1982, you said?
Yes.
And at what stage of your career, life, and so forth were you? And had you had episodes like that prior, and have you had them since?
Well, so I hadn't had any prior. I was hospitalized for a few days in 1985, and then I was really lucky because I found a psychiatrist who said, anybody who doesn't get sleep will, become psychotic, or I like to say go crazy. And all you have to do, you just need to learn how to deal with that. And I just had so much going on. I'd been practicing law for 4 years, and I was opening my law office, and actually I was running for the legislature, and I'd just gotten back from Europe. And so I just had all this stuff going on. And I had no idea before that happened that my mind could become unreliable. It was just, I mean, it's unthinkable. But I found out that it could, and so then I really tried to arrange my life so I wouldn't get in that kind of situation. And actually, if I get to the point where I'm in trouble, which has been, I don't know, quite a long time, maybe 10 years, I will take something to help me sleep, and usually just for one night, and that breaks the cycle. And even that one night, I'll know that the next night I'll have trouble sleeping just from kind of the withdrawal effects of the dose. But that's basically what I've done. I mean, so one of the things is that I'm no longer doing litigation, but I would almost always file whatever was due, briefs or whatever, motions, the day before they were due, because and that's very unusual for a lawyer, because you can always make it better. So you make do it, go through it, make it better, make changes, and then you put it in. So that's one of the things that I would do, and that way, what happens is I'm working on a project and I can't stop thinking about it, and then I can't sleep. So I try and deal with that.
Okay, so were you angry that they treated you that way? Did you? I mean, in a sense, you put yourself in harm's way. I suppose. We should always expect individuality in our treatment and whatnot, but there is a little bit of a kind of a societal hazard to having people act and go crazy. I don't think it's a trivial thing. A lot of our cities, I think, are in active decline because we are, in a sense, undertreating a certain amount of mental illness, and we have, back in the day, we had kind of probably more compulsory psychiatric wards and so forth, but we didn't, also, maybe that there were some overdiagnoses there, but there also were not people, kind of going crazy or threatening or doing violence on the streets or camping out and kind of ruining the social fabric of a lot of, urban life and potentially their own lives. So, I understand that your case might have been one of, I don't know, I mean, maybe a mislabeling. I mean, did they actually, kind of pluck you out of the legal profession? And did your dander get up because of that? And how did you? I don't know. So, what was the next step in your battles, and what do you think about some of the kind of necessarily sort of default positions of being a little bit cautious about people who act crazy?
So I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and certainly the homeless problem. I mean, I think there's, frankly, a quite simple solution to the homeless problem, which is homes. I mean, we've got, things have just gotten so expensive and whatever. But the main thing is,
I can give quick little pushback on that. I mean, I actually don't really like the word homeless, because I think homeless implies, something that you had and lost. To the same extent, the homeless are homeless. I'm also yachtless and jetless and a bunch of things which I never have worked to have, and I never had in the first place. If a tornado came and absconded with my home, I came home like Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, and it took her a while to get home. But, if the tornado took my house away, I would be homeless, yes, because I had worked for home, I had a home and so forth. But a lot of the people who are homeless are actually, severely mentally ill, and they've never had, the coinage, the down payment, the bona fides, the job, and so forth, that would get them a house or maintain it. So if you're just talking about giving people homes or houses or whatever, I mean, there probably are, median situations short of a home, but, some type of group living, supervision and so forth, halfway houses, quarter houses, whatever you want to call them, where people can kind of work towards accumulating the kind of the outer trappings of a life, but a lot of them don't have that capability per se. And I've over the years, I've seen and treated a fair number of them. But at any rate, so I apologize for that that interruption. But carry on. So,
well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff, so it's hard to remember everything to react to. But I think the big issue is what should be the response.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty clear that you call them antipsychotics. I call them neuroleptics because, frankly, they don't have an antipsychotic effect on most people. What they do is they literally block 70 to 90% of the dopamine transmission in the frontal lobe and the basal ganglia and the limbic system, which has all kinds of behavioral results, which is basically to clamp down on people so they can't be disturbing. And I used to think of them, before I knew this, of them as a chemical straitjacket. But what they are is literally a chemical lobotomy, because they block 70 to 90% of the dopamine transmission in the frontal lobe. And so the brain's response to that is to pump out more dopamine for a few weeks and then grow more dopamines. So there's never been any discovery of brain abnormalities in people, say, diagnosed with schizophrenia until after the introduction of the drugs. And then there are all kinds of...
Fair enough. That's an interesting point. But so I'm just going to ask you as a point of definition. When you say they're not antipsychotics, they're neuroleptics. How do you... I know some Greek, but I'm kind of flummoxed on the actual etymology of neuroleptic. Can you fill me in on that?
Yeah, so neuroleptic was actually, there were two names for this class of drugs when they were first introduced. Neuroleptic, which means seize the brain, and
like
major
neuroleptic.
Well, those are no. And then major tranquilizer, which was to distinguish them from what they call the minor tranquilizers, which are the benzodiazepines, which at the time was, like Valium, but now, Ativan and Xanax and, I can't remember all of them, but so that's how I think of them. But the big point is that there's this assumption that people that get diagnosed with mental illness have a permanent condition and they'll never recover. And one of the things I do in my book is there are various people that were involved in that event, or series of events that were are psychiatric survivors. And they were all, I think, diagnosed with schizophrenia. And they all managed to get through it and go on to quite remarkably productive and lives. And so this idea that people don't get better really is, I think, largely caused by the drugs. And the reason why I say that is that there's this program in Finland, in part of Lapland, called the Open Dialogue Approach, and they did studies on it. And they have this interpersonal approach, they have this team approach, and they consider the problem as basically the spaces between people. And they have a mobile team, and they go out and they, and they bring in everybody, and their recovery rate is 80%. 80% is people presenting with a first-time psychosis. And actually, in the 1970s, there was a project by Lauren Mosier of the National Institute of Mental Health. He was the chief of schizophrenia research at the time, called Soteria House. And they had this house, and their mantra was to be with people rather than to do with them. And they tried not to use the neuroleptics for at least 6 weeks to see if they could get people through it, and they got a similar result. Okay, now our current system, and this is based on a study by Harrow and Job, our current system results in a 5 or 6% recovery rate, from 80% to 5 or 6%, and this same study by Harrow and Job, they showed that people that had been on the neuroleptics for a while and then got off them they had a 40% chance of recovering. Well, that's, eight
So
times better than.
what's recovering in this case? Never having another relapse, or
Well, it's basically not, not being in treatment, but basically having relationships, school or work, not being on disability. So, and so to me, so that's why I say I seem like I'm yelling. That's why I say, to me, the big issue is what should be the response to it. And I'm not really litigating now, but my big effort right now is to to help people start and maintain programs that have been proven to work, and such as
okay.
Soteria houses.
So your idea would be to kind of, in a sense, communitize, socialize. I'm not socialism, but socially acclimate, and or treat with kind of dignity, conversation, respect, coordination, rather than pharmacologically.
Yes, and the force. I
The
mean,
what?
the force where people, are literally, I mean, let's say in the forced drugging context, if someone refuses to take, the drug, they are taken down by 3 or 4 staff people. Their pants are pulled down and they're given an injection. So that's force. And then, of course, I think of involuntary commitment. I mean, that's, in my mind, is a euphemism. If you really look at it, it's psychiatric imprisonment, and so that's force too. And you can say it's for the people's, best interests, and they don't know that. They don't. They're,
Right.
they're,
Yeah. I mean, I get
insane,
what
so
you're
they
saying.
don't know anything. But people who have worked in this area, they'll say, and this is my experience too, is what's considered, kind of lunatic ravings. There's always some meaning behind it, and if you, just work with the person. And the thing is, people basically in this condition are often terrified. Almost, well, 80% have had serious trauma in their background, and the most important thing is to make them feel safe. And all this force just escalates the problem. So, um, so one of the things that I was involved in, I'm working with what's called the International Peer Respite and Soteria Summit. And peer respites are short-term, basically crisis places where people can come to, and they're run and staffed by people, it's called, with lived experience of having gone through the system and then gotten through it. And so other people can too, but people with, peers, they're called, can relate to those people in these extreme states in a way that many other people can't. But the key is not to be freaked out when someone's, completely bonkers. I mean, so
Well,
what?
that's that's a tricky proposition. My background, I'm a medical doctor, and I did a part of a residency in psychiatry back 1,000 years ago, um, and so I hear what you're saying, but I also feel like I have a reasonable grounding in statistics and science and so forth, and science is. But I wonder whether the case of Jim Gottstein is necessarily generalizable. So let's say, for whatever reason, you went bonkers, to use your term, but you're, really a super great guy, and you're, easy to talk to, knowledgeable and intelligent and so forth. And you've managed to, settle back on your feet. All well and good. Over the years, literally, I'm not joking about this. I've treated in my own private, it's public, I guess, quasi, in my own primary care office, I treated schizophrenics. I'm going to keep that term for now. One of whom, was very easy with a knife. he cut his relatives, he cut himself. Nobody died, but body parts were lost. And this is, I don't think you necessarily can wait for him to get, for him to have this kind of one bonkers episode, and then we're, treat him nicely and then move on, because, the chance, if he's in some kind of community, that if there's a knife in the kitchen, that, somebody else is going to lose something. So there are situations when, our criteria for admission was, one of them was, a danger to oneself or others or both. Those, I think there are going to be gradations. There might be, people who have some kind of exigency situation, sleep deprivation, whatever you want to call it, that might have a single episode, and perhaps they should be observed. And if it's atypical, at a certain stage in life, that's not kind of the typical turning point for schizophrenia, which tends to be the late teens or something like that. All well and good. I mean, maybe they go on a different track, but I have to, be a little bit skeptical about kind of an all for one, one for all kind of approach.
So, again, there's a lot there. So the first thing I would say is, I suspect you haven't read Anatomy of an Epidemic by Bob Whitaker, and he spoke at, that scientific.
Yeah, the conference in Copenhagen. Yes, I met him.
I think my book is great. I'm very proud of it. I think it's very readable. But to get and it gives a pretty in-depth analysis of a couple slices of the issue. But Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker really goes through the science of this and all the studies and basically, psychiatry studies and what they really show. And I highly recommend it. For the guy who, is attacking people with a knife, that's a crime. He should be locked up for a crime. But I don't think that justifies putting drugs into him that, are going to damage him. Now, I know people who find the drugs helpful, and they should have them. Right. But the idea of forcing drugs into people they don't want, and I could say a lot more about that.
Right. But, so let me just ask you.
I want to say one other thing,
okay,
which we had a Soteria house in Alaska, and at one point we had someone who we were worried about with the knives, and we hid the knives when that person was in the house. Mm-hmm. So I understand what you're saying, and so, but the thing is that. I just think you have to look at this. 80% recovery rate is possible.
Okay, well, I'm going to look at that. So I'm going to ask you. Yeah, I'll ask you to put a link up for our audience to show what that is and how it's comprised and how it was studied. But let me ask you just something that kind of bubbled up in my head. Does your statement that my former psychiatric schizophrenic patient should serve the time, as it were, for the crime, does that ablate, get rid of the insanity defense? Should there be an insanity defense, or should we treat the crime for what it is?
I basically don't agree with the insanity defense, and it basically doesn't really exist in the U.S. And in fact, it technically exists in a very limited way, and people. So as a lawyer, unless your client is risking the death penalty, the insanity defense, even winning on the insanity defense is probably worse for your client, because you get locked up for X period of years for the crime, and then you get locked up indefinitely as a psychiatric inmate.
Yeah, you theoretically, like I guess it was Hinckley. I forget, one shot John Lennon. Chapman shot John Lennon, and Hinckley shot Reagan. They were about the same time, so I sometimes tie them together. But Hinckley, I guess, is on the verge of getting out, or has come out, and now he's doing folk songs and what, as opposed to having potentially served a death penalty for it. So, in his case, it sounds to me like I just can't imagine that the psychiatric hospital is as dire a situation as maximum security federal prison?
I talk to people. Some people say the hospitals are better, and some people say the jail, prison is better. So I think on balance, it's not as bad an environment in the hospital as in the prison.
Okay.
But you're still locked up and stuff. And it was Hinckley shooting Reagan that caused I think every state in the United States to change their insanity defense laws to make them very strict. So, for example, you've got to think that the person that you're attacking has been possessed by some demon or something like that to qualify. That's not really that person. I mean, so it's really a very restricted defense now.
Fair enough. Right,
Now
so
there's another one called guilty but mentally ill. It's phrased differently, and to me that's the worst of both worlds, where you plead guilty and then say, but I was mentally ill. So then you serve your time and then you go into the hospital. But once you're civilly committed, you theoretically, have the right to get out when you're, quote, no longer a danger to self or others. Okay. But it tends to be a very long time, and the authorities are pretty reluctant to let people out who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity or guilty.
So I'd like to get back to your central thesis, and maybe you can state it for us, and then what you're doing towards that end, and what you think people should come away with.
Yeah, well, for the 80% of people, what I've found is that most people who end up psychotic are they will say that something happened to them in their childhood, that oftentimes abuse, and that they feel set them up for their problems, and then something in the recent future, in the recent past, put them over the edge. And so we've just you just need to engage with the person. I mean, obviously you need to make sure that things are safe to the extent that you can. Now, I'm working with this International Peer Respite Soteria Summit, and I recently did, I'll put that in there, a playlist, and Dr. Al Galves went through what was the essential features of these successful programs. And I can't recite it right offhand, but the basic idea is you don't try and force people to do something, because that's really violence against that person, and it creates a reaction. And the typical, the mental health system's interpretation of that is that it's a product of their quote mental illness. But when you think about it, if someone who is pretty knowledgeable about the drugs and knows that really they're harmful to them. I mean, people diagnosed with serious mental illness in the public mental health system in the United States have 25-year shorter lifespans, 20 to 25-year shorter lifespans. And we've got this research up on the PsychRights.org website. And Dr. David Healy did a study of patients around 1900, and they had normal lifespans. And it's almost all, this reduction is almost all because of the drugs. And the fact that that's, you're going to push back on that. But the fact that, and that's indisputable, of the shortened lifespans. Now, people dispute what the cause of it is, but that people diagnosed with serious mental illness have 20 to 25 years shorter lifespans doesn't cause an uproar, really shows, that society doesn't really care about these people, and that's an acceptable outcome. And but what these programs do is, first, people have to be They need to feel safe. And one of the ways to feel safe is not to force them to do anything. And they need to have, one of the things that's terrible about our current system is the basic message is that abandon all hope, ye who enter here. I mean, this idea that you have some kind of brain defect, you'll never be better, you'll have to take these drugs, these debilitating drugs for the rest of your life. And the best you can hope for is a very diminished life, and that maybe you won't be, cycle in and out of the hospital so much. So that's just a terrible message, and it's not true. So one of the things, that's critically important is that people have hope and that people believe in them. Those are two things. So that's what these programs do. And I'm distracted right now, but I'll try and send you the link of this playlist. It's 4 short videos that total 11 minutes that I think kind of go through the basics of this. And so, for example, one of the people in this video talks about she was in a peer respite, and they asked her, what if anything in the hospital did you find helpful? And she said, well, I don't really like my answer, but if I was locked in a room for a few days, that really helped me, really helped me. And the response was, well, we have locks, but they're on the inside. And if you want to stay in your room, you can stay in your room. And so, and she found, that, really helped her. And she's kind of a superstar now she's a staff member at Pure Respite and really very insightful in all this stuff. And there, you made the point that I'm not typical in that, I got through it. And what I've found is there are lots of people that have done that. And basically that's what told to all of them. Oh, you weren't, your schizophrenia diagnosis wasn't really accurate. And that's, circular, because the idea is if you have schizophrenia, you don't get better. So therefore, if you got better, you didn't have schizophrenia.
I appreciate that. And I don't think there's a strict, test like a test for streptococcus or pregnancy that will, pinpoint schizophrenia. I'm with you there. I just was curious. When I was young, before I was maybe in medical school, I made a trip to Morocco. And at a cafe, I met a young man came up to me and my friend and claimed he was Muhammad. It's usually what we get in the United States is people have, delusions of grandeur and they think they're Jesus Christ. So it was a little bit interesting that, in an Islamic country, he thought he was Muhammad, all well and good. And he was acting it out. And, he genuinely, and I don't think it was a dramatic theatrical piece, whatever. And he wasn't looking for money. He was fairly well off and so forth. But he had, there are very kind of typical signs across the board that cross nations and cultures and so forth of kind of the schizophrenic presentation, in my view. And I think there's, been shown to be like a reasonably similar percentage and a reasonably similar age of onset for schizophrenia. So speaking to that, because it seems to be a worldwide problem that, not the same as Down syndrome, but, whenever we travel, we always, see some Down syndrome from some other country. Till recently with Europe, I guess they pre-abort. But with schizophrenia or psychosis, do you find that there are some other countries that have been better at this than the United States and doing, less medication? And then I guess the second part of this question would be, do you think the medication is just for the psychopharmaceuticals or the sake of kind of easing up what, doctors have to do in terms of diagnosis?
Well, there's a couple things in there. So you asked what countries do better. So the World Health Organization did a couple studies, and these are on the PsychRights website, scientific research by topic. Robert Whitaker did a previous book called Mad in America, and that's really got me into this particular phase of my work. And I post all of the studies that he cite in Mad in America, the full studies. And there were 2 studies by the World Health Organization. I forget exactly when. And they compared, Western country results with developing country results. And they found that people in the developing countries had much higher recovery rates than in the Western world. And they thought, well, maybe they're not taking their medication, and this was so weird. And they did another study with different countries, and they found the same thing. And their conclusion was the best predictor for not recovering from, after a diagnosis of schizophrenia is to live in a developed country where they give the drugs. And they found in the undeveloped countries, they didn't give the drugs. They didn't, they basically didn't have the money to do it.
Right.
And that's kind of changing now because the whole world is adopting, the Western idea that
the undeveloped world is not undeveloped anymore.
Right. So I think it was like 75 or something.
No, it's harder to do.
That's another data point on this idea that the drugs are dramatically reducing recovery.
Well, I see some other aspects redolent of your point throughout medicine, society, psychiatry. I think there is there's a kind of a zealous impulse to over medicate and over medicalize a lot of what are behaviors. And so I do, find some sympathy for part of your argument. And I'm not necessarily sure on a case-by-case basis, like to quote Potter Stewart, regarding, the pornography case, I think I know it when I see it. But leaving that idiosyncrasy behind, I think that we've kind of over-medicated and over-medicalized the behavior that gets called ADD. I think we've done similar things with narcotic and other drug abuses to call them diseases and have them be something that needs to be medicated, with methadone or Suboxone indefinitely. I think there are, instances where people veer in their lives. They kind of, if they're bowling, they're kind of going into the gutter, kind of literally or figuratively, often depending. And they don't necessarily need to stay there or be kept off the bowling alley forever. But I think we tend to do that. And I think there's, an industry there. And I've written a book, it's not out yet, about narcotic de-addiction. And I think there's what I call the kind of the methadone industrial complex. And you could generalize that to psychiatric pharmaceutical, that, a lot of things are, aiming to be medicated. And so now we're bringing up this kind of gender dysphoria, which will be not necessarily psych, but, be medicated for life, after your, pre-pubertal blockers and whatnot, you'll be on something forever. And I think this becomes a good kind of like business model, a little bit like the Starbucks model for caffeine, but for, all kinds of other drugs. And I think that this has become a little bit more pervasive medically over time than, say, the 1970s.
Yeah, I think it used to be medicine, was to quote, to cure people of, kind of acute conditions, and now it's to manage, so, you cure someone and they're no longer a customer, and I say customer instead of patient.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't think customer's a bad model.
Yeah, and then, but if you have a condition that has to be, medicated for indefinite for life, well, that's recurring revenue, and that's a much better business model. And I don't know. Anyway,
can I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Are you on any, or from that point on, had you been on any, or are you on any, neuroleptic, psychiatric, active medications, either acutely or prophylactically, or how's that all been handled, and how have the people around you thought about either the taking or the not taking of same?
Well, I I was given Mellaril when I was in the hospital in 1982. I said, "Oh, I don't want Thorazine," and they said, "Oh, this is nothing like Thorazine." Well, it's exactly like Thorazine, but and so I it's been years, but if I get into trouble, I will um, I will take a benzo. The one I like is Halcyon because
Mm-hmm.
it gives the most delicious sleep.
Hmm.
And but it's got a bad rep because especially in the UK, people were going out and murdering people on it, and a much higher dose than I did. But I only, with rare exception, I'd only take it for one night to just block,
Right.
to stop the cycle. And so I I recognize, it's not rocket science. If I'm not sleeping, I'm going to get into trouble. So and so there's an escalating series of things that happen. And so the first thing is I'll get kind of sharp and witty, and really no one but me knows, but I know, okay, that's something. Um,
That happens to me
uh,
every day.
yeah. So, well, some people are just naturally that. But anyway, so then the next thing is I'll have what's called thought blocking, where you say, you're talking, then you kind of stop in the middle. It's not quite the same as trying to find a word, but you kind of stop, and that that is kind of another stage. And then the next stage is I'll think people are looking at me funny,
Hmm.
and that's not a good sign. And so what I do, my reaction to that is first say people probably aren't looking at me funny. I mean, that's one of the things that I found where maybe I am different than most is that I actually kind of recognize when I'm going up this. But a lot of people can, but a lot of people just automatically assume your mind is being, you know, is accurately portraying things. But anyway, so I go, they're probably not looking at me weird. But if they are, it's because I'm doing something weird.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what I do is I actually kind of think of myself as looking down on the scene to see what I'm doing and make
Right.
sure that I'm not. And
So
then
you have a
and
fair amount of insight, and again, you have, you're the Jim Gottstein case of being Jim
but
Gottstein, and you might have a little bit of more of the Harvard law kind of case study approach than many other people are have within their capabilities to apply.
but
Other
most
people,
but most people can be to helped so that I mean maybe I have some characteristics about that. But the point is that most people really can be helped so that they can do the same thing and find strategies
fair enough.
to avoid it. I mean, there's a program called RAP, the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, and they there's a whole thing about how to recognize your problems, have
Mm-hmm.
an emergency plan, and and what to do,
All right, so let me
what to
ask you
do
a
about
couple other questions. Do you have people around you who notice the same thing? I don't know what your living situation is. Are there stresses applied um, to people who might see you as a Tinder keg or something like that about to go off? I mean, are there issues for the people? Again, I'm not sure what your living situation is, but has that factored in?
Well, I'm married, and so every once in a while, my wife will, you know, will will say something, and I'm aware of it. But I manage things very successfully, and I haven't. I was hospitalized in 1982 for 30 days. Then I found this psychiatrist, who really said you can deal with it. But I got in a situation again where I didn't get sleep, um,
Hmm.
uh, and I was hospitalized for about a week. And that was in
So, if,
1985.
if you were to if you were to give yourself a diagnosis, I mean, if any, what would it be?
Human.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. All right. So I'm kind of turning around the corner and trying to think of how to conclude our interview here. So I'm going to cede the floor to you. for the next couple, 3-4 minutes, and maybe you can tell our audience what you would do, if you were kind of given the keys to the kingdom, and how they can, get a hold of you, and what do you think is a reasonable call to action on the presumption that you are correct?
Well, I think the most important thing to do is to have these alternatives, where people have the choice not to take the drugs. I have these alternatives that have been shown to work, such as peer respites, Soteria houses, open dialogue approach, healing homes, intentional peer support. These have all been shown to be very effective, and we just need to make them generally available. And that's what I'm spending my time on these days. It's pretty easy to find me. You Google my name, but my email address is jim.gottstein@psychrights.org, psychrights.org. That's the most important thing, is to just making these other approaches more available. I mean, interestingly, there's a guy at Pesach Lichtenberg, and I forget the everyone something, in Israel, and he started a Soteria house there, and he takes umbrage at the idea that it's an alternative, because now I've heard there's as many as 12 of these Soteria houses in Israel, and they're part of the system. And so that's what we need, is these other approaches that work, and so that we move closer, hopefully achieve the 80% recovery rate that has been shown to be possible. And so far we haven't figured out the 20%, but let's get to the 80%.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jim. Do you have any comments or questions before we go?
No, not really. I don't know if I can save this chat, but let's.
Yeah, well, we'll come up with that later.
I'll send you some links.
Yeah, we can chat after I end this recording. But I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to ask questions. Contact Mr. Gottstein or me. And thanks so much for paying attention. I hope you come back and listen to more of our conversations. Thank you.